Welcome into Be Conscious. I'm Damien Barling. Coming up in just a few minutes, Pulitzer Prize winning journalist for the Washington Post and author of They Can't Kill Us All, Wesley Lowery will join me. Wesley was the lead on the Fatal Force project that tracked 990 police shootings in 2015. Not only did the project win him the Pulitzer Prize, shockingly, it was the first of its kind. Nothing of the sort existed at the time. It led to the Justice Department creating a comprehensive set of use of force statistics. In the same vein, just last week, Wesley and his team of researchers at the Washington Post put out a piece called Murder with Impunity. They mapped 52,000 homicides in this country and found areas where murder is common, but arrests are not. So Wesley's going to join us here in just a couple of minutes. I want to take this time to thank everyone who tuned in to our first episode of Be Conscious last week. I'm quite thankful for the response that this has gotten. If you didn't get the opportunity to hear my conversation with Howard Bryant, I can't recommend it enough. It was one of the most fascinating conversations I've had in my career in communications, radio or otherwise. We talked a great deal about athletes and activism, the history of athletes and activism. We talked a lot about his new book, The Heritage, and it's real easy for you to find. It's the only other episode we've got besides this one. So if you missed our first episode with Howard Bryant, go back into the archives and check that out, and make sure you subscribe so you never miss an episode. We're on iTunes. We're on Google Play now, TuneIn, Stitcher. You can pretty much find us anywhere. So subscribe. We don't want you to miss out on anything. And while you're there, if you wouldn't mind, shoot us a rate and review. Hit that 5 stars. That really helps this podcast get noticed across the various platforms. You can share it on Facebook, Twitter. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. I'm pretty easy to find across all those social media networks. I'm at Damien Barling. I love to interact and get your thoughts on this podcast, whether this podcast concept collectively or each of the individual episodes. I can't recommend the Washington Post piece, Murder with Impunity, enough. It's a deep, comprehensive dive into the homicide rate versus arrest rate across America. As a matter of fact, 34 of the 50 cities they studied have a lower arrest rate than they did a decade ago. And instead of making rash judgments on why that is, the team at the Washington Post decided to figure out why and see what some of these places have in common. So with all that said, I'd like to welcome in Wesley Lowery, the Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, author, and part of the team that researched Murder with Impunity. He's also a Washington Wizards season ticket holder and a Cleveland native. You doing okay post-finals, by the way?
I'm hanging in there.
I believe I believe you and J.R. Smith both have the Cavs winning in 9.
Yes, correct. That was my call. We got this in 9. Oh, J.R., I'm not happy with him.
Keep holding out hope, man. It'll get there. I want to start with Murder with Impunity, if we could. How did this project get started?
Sure. And so this was a project that really kind of grew out of reporting we've been doing. So I work on a team that works largely on police accountability. But police accountability is not just writing down every time the police do something controversial. It's also attempting to quantify and qualify how well the police are doing the jobs that they're supposed to be doing, right? And so we had, going back now to 2015 and 2016, there had been a conversation, especially during the presidential campaign, about what was true in terms of which way are we trending in terms of justice, right? We had historic lows in terms of violent crime, but at the time, candidate Donald Trump and Jeff Sessions, who is now the Attorney General, were talking about this idea that there could be a crime wave coming, and murder was spiking in cities like Chicago and Baltimore. And so we were kicking around and debating what accountability journalism might we do on this question of violence? And in part inspired by a really great book, Ghettoside, and also some conversations that have been happening amongst criminologists, we really settled on this idea of, what if we quantified for the first time comprehensively how well police do at solving murders, and if there are certain types of people, certain groups of people, certain neighborhoods that almost never receive justice. Again, to kind of grapple with this question of what happens if there are places where murder is functionally legal? What happens if there are neighborhoods where 10 people or 15 people might be murdered in a decade and no one is arrested for any of them? How does that erode relationships? How does that create actual impunity? And how does that delegitimize the criminal justice system? And how does it do that long before the viral video of a police shooting or a beating or something like that?
And I assume there's some common traits between the places with lower homicide arrests share.
Certainly. What we've found broadly, so again, what we did is we got about a decade worth of data from 50 cities, case level data, so we know who the person is, their age, their race, their gender, where they were killed, so we can look at the neighborhood demographics as well. We found some broad disparities in arrest rates. White victims are much more likely to have their homicide result in an arrest than Black or Latino victims. But what we also found were those neighborhoods, these pockets of impunity, places where there had been a high amount of violence and a low level of justice. And those places were predominantly poor Black and Latino neighborhoods. That said, it's not every poor Black and Latino neighborhood lives in this type of impunity. There are high violence neighborhoods that are poor. There are high violence neighborhoods that are Black and Latino or minority populations where they do see a lot of their homicides solved. And so it raises this question. I think sometimes it's kind of easy to go, well, of course that side of town deals with these issues. But there are major American cities where their rough side of the tracks or their violent neighborhood still sees a high level of arrest in their homicides. So it raises the question of why that's not true more broadly.
Now, I know you talked to a number of police officers. You talked to a number of police chiefs for this piece. How do they explain this? Where do they put the blame?
So it cuts in a few different directions. I mean, I think that none of the chiefs we talked to, in every single case, so we made a map of all 50 cities. And in every city, we allowed the city to see the map before publication if they wanted to dispute anything, if we got anything wrong, in part because it's computerized. If we're not familiar with a city, and the computer accidentally puts one neighborhood in one place because of some type of coding error, we wanted someone who really intimately knew the city to look at the maps and make sure nothing was wrong. But that said, what the police say is they think that these maps basically show places where their relationships are the most deteriorated, and it becomes a chicken and egg, right? Homicide requires cooperation, right? In almost every homicide, in almost every murder, someone knows who did it. And the question between solving one and not solving one is whether or not a community will tell you what they know. Now, it cuts, like I said, it becomes the cycle, because if you are someone who never solves any homicide and you show up at the front door of my apartment and you want me to give you information about the murderer who lives in my apartment building, and again, you're someone who never solves any homicides, of course I'm not going to do that, right? That makes no sense. Versus if you are someone who always solves homicide, right? Now, so again, the failure to solve homicide makes people less willing on the back end to then cooperate in the next ones, and without that cooperation, it becomes impossible to solve them. There are some other things that come up. There are questions of resourcing, questions of priority. We talk a lot about crime rates. We don't necessarily talk a lot about solve rates. I don't know of any police chief who's been fired because his department didn't solve enough crimes. I know plenty of police chiefs who've been fired because crime has increased, right? And so it also kind of challenges societally and culturally how we think about crime, right? How we think about the police. What is the role of the police? Is it to prevent crime, or is it to secure justice for people who have experienced crime? And is it something in between the two of those things? But there's a scale there, and it does raise a question. Are there some cities where perhaps this is leaned too far on one side? It's all preventative. But what happens to those people who still are victims and to their families? Because what we know is if they don't ever receive justice, that's a whole family that now has less faith in the system, is less likely to cooperate moving forward.
I think you mentioned John Skaggs, I believe was his name, was a detective from Los Angeles who solved crimes at a massive rate. I think of like 90%. He solved the homicide crimes that he was involved in, and he put the blame on detectives not willing to go out there and get in the streets.
Yeah, so Skaggs is a guy, this is the second time I'll name drop it, but there's this book by a former editor of mine, Julie Ovey, based in L.A. called Ghetto Side, and Skaggs is a major character in that book. An L.A. detective, former L.A. detective now, with a massive reputation of solving crime. And what he would always talk about was that for him it was about really working the streets, being out there, talking to family members, making that extra call, building these relationships. He would talk about specifically working on wives and girlfriends, right? That the types of people who might hear something, right? The wife and the girlfriend or the mother of the victim, who someone in the community might tell them what happened, or the wife and girlfriend or mother of the suspect who they might confess to or say something to, and who might feel bad themselves. And so he really does. Him and many other detectives we talked to did. Many of them had some not kindest things to say about some of their colleagues. That they think too many detectives like sitting at their desks or are lazy or are under-resourced. Right. One thing we're looking at in some follow-up stories is, how many in a given city, how many cases in a year is a detective dealing with? Because what we know is that these are hard and complicated cases. As reporters, we know that someone doesn't always answer the phone the first time you call. Sometimes you got to call back and call back and call back and door knock and email. Well, if you don't have time to do that, that means you might not get that source, right? Homicide and detective work is very similar, right? You show up to try to talk to a witness and they're not there. And do you have time to call back the next day? Do you have time to email the next day? Do you have time to stake out their school or their work? If you do, you might finally get them, and that could be the crucial piece of evidence. But if you don't, if you're so, spread so thin, all of a sudden have another case to work on, you may never circle back and get that crucial evidence that you need to close a case.
Yeah, I feel like because of the nature of this conversation, we have to point out that Detective Skaggs is white. And does that play a factor? It's not like, you're in Los Angeles, you're trying to solve crimes in Los Angeles, you're a white detective. It's not like he's blending in these neighborhoods. Is that, does that play a factor with some of these neighborhoods that you studied in Murder with Impunity?
So we've seen this in a few different directions, right? There's certainly a perception sometimes in minority communities that white detectives or white officers are less likely to have these relationships or less likely to care. I think that there's a perception sometimes among the detectives themselves that a white officer or white detective might have less of a chance of building these relationships. But that said, we've talked to a number of white detectives who've been extremely successful in these communities that, again, in some ways, not unlike reporting, so much of this job from the officers who we talk to is about building relationships and building trust. And that someone like Skaggs can show up in a community and be there consistently, show up for these families and build an outsized reputation for themselves, and then become the person who is known for really caring, right? In some ways, that cuts in both directions. When people have low expectations for you, it can be easy to exceed them. If people assume, look, these officers don't care, especially these white detectives, they don't care, and then all of a sudden you got a guy who you can see is really putting in work to make sure that your brother gets justice or your father gets justice or your cousin gets justice, well, all of a sudden, that's someone who you're going to build a relationship with.
So it's fair to say that trust of the police is an issue in these areas?
Oh, unquestionably, and that's historic. I mean, with good reason. It cuts in several directions. You think about neighborhoods in Baltimore, Chicago. Places that have seen very aggressive street policing historically and in recent history as they try to combat violence. And if you live in one of those communities, chances are you're being stopped, questioned, and frisked. When you and your buddies are staying on the corner, you're being dispersed by cops. You might have what we know from some of these Department of Justice reports. You might have taken an errant elbow or been thrown up against a wall or worse, right? And so you're someone who's receiving a high quantity of police interactions. You're dealing with the police all the time. But then when someone kills a member of your family, no one is arrested for it. High quantity interaction, low quality interactions, right? So those relationships and that trust deteriorates from two ends. It's not just what community members would describe as harassment or over-policing. It's also then the failure to provide adequate police resources, and police services for the things that matter most. When someone steals my car, do the police get it back? When someone assaults my son, do the police arrest them, right? And I think that what we see in some of these communities, again, is that deterioration at both ends.
Yeah, I read a particular section over and over again because I'm still convinced that I read it wrong. There's a 12-block stretch in Omaha that has less than a 15% arrest rate. Is that right?
Yes.
That's astonishing.
And we see little pockets like that in almost every city we look at. Now, what's interesting about Omaha is, and it's one of the reasons I chose Omaha to base this story, at least the beginning and it begins and ends in Omaha, is because it's not the place. You expect when you start a big murder series to be in Baltimore, to be in Chicago, to be in New Orleans, to be in Philadelphia. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to show how this is kind of a universal experience, that no matter where you're living. And what's interesting about Omaha is Omaha does a very good job of solving murder. This is a city that last year made an arrest in 70% 70% of its homicides. And it's a city that's really focused on this. But even in a city like that, even a city where 7 in 10 or 8 in 10 homicides result in arrest, there are places where almost no homicides result in arrest. It really is that kind of tale of two cities, right? If you live on this side of the block or in this neighborhood, this is your experience and this is your likelihood of justice, versus if you live, half a mile away, this is your experience. And that's kind of what we're hoping to underscore with this mapping, is this idea that you can live in a city that makes arrest in almost all of its homicides, but live in a place in that city where almost no arrest happened in homicides.
I can't recommend Murder with Impunity enough. It's a really extraordinary study, and yet it's still probably the second biggest study that you are a part of, the Fatal Force Project, in which you won the Pulitzer Prize for just a couple of years ago. I know it's a reach. Were there any similarities between these two projects?
Well, certainly there are similarities, and that project, which began in 2015, and it was a massive Washington Post group effort, sought to quantify how many fatal police shootings happen. There's no good federal data on this, and so what we did and continue to do is each day track fatal police shootings. This project is similar in a few reasons. First of all, it's another big omnibus team project, right? I'm really fortunate to get to be one of the lead reporters on it, but even on that first story, there's 12, 13, 14 people. By the end of the year, we might be in the dozens of people. Fatal Force was similar. There's over 60 people involved in that project. It's similar in that it's a massive data collection project. What we did in Murder with Impunity is we went into 50 cities, and we're going to additional cities now, so it'll grow. Got a decade of data, and it was hyper-specific, detailed data. A lot of these cities didn't want to necessarily give it up. Some of them weren't sure they had it. In some cases, we're getting mailed printed out PDFs, and we're having to enter stuff by hand. We're having to combine 4 different databases to get one piece of information from each. And so it was a massive data collection work, much like Fatal Force. What's also true here, and what's true generally in the work we're trying to do, is we're trying to create information and provide information that is otherwise unknowable, right? That it's no one's job to compare policing in Oakland to San Francisco, to Phoenix, to Albuquerque, to Miami, to Durham, to Louisville, right? Yeah. That you have great police reporters in all of those cities and in many cities who are doing this type of work at the local level. And our thought is, how can we do something that feels national in scope, that really analytically compares these things place to place? And that was similar for Fatal Force, where we were looking at the entire nation and police shootings that are happening. Our goal, as always, is to create a resource, right, that we already have academics and police chiefs and prosecutors reaching out, asking for our data, which we've published all online so that the data nerds can do whatever they want with it, right? And so we're just trying to put information into the public sphere, whether you agree with all of our analysis or not, whether you think that we completely missed the point, or all of the raw material is online now, so anyone can use it however they want. I just heard from a police department yesterday asking a hyper-specific question because they want to run their own analysis of our raw data. Awesome. Here you go. Now you guys have it. Now they can compare themselves to these other cities. And so the hope, again, is to try to provide a public service.
If the book that you were referencing, Ghetto Side, is a companion piece to the first part of our conversation, then your book, They Can't Kill Us All, is a companion piece to the second part of our conversation here. The way you got to Ferguson was really extraordinary, because you were kind of just sent there as a, hey, Wes, go knock this out for us. Come right back. We just need someone on the ground.
Yes, no, exactly. This is August 2014. I remember, I will never forget sending my buddies a group text, and saying, "Hey, I got to go to Missouri for 2 days. I'll be back for baseball this weekend." Because we all sit in the sports bar too often, right? And so I basically had to let them know I wasn't MIA, but I'd be back. Don't make any Saturday plans without me. Thought I was going to be there for 3 days, and I ended up in Ferguson, Missouri for about 3 months. And now I've been on this beat for more than 3 years. And so it really, it's fascinating kind of how that works. At the time, I was a national political reporter for us covering Congress. I was getting ready to go on the presidential trail in early 2015. Would have been probably following someone like Scott Walker around, right, or Chris Christie. But instead, got kind of thrust into this story in Ferguson, covering the protest that spawned from the police shooting of Michael Brown. Spent 3 months in Ferguson, ended up in New York for Eric Gardner, in my hometown of Cleveland for Tamir Rice. And then as 2014 turned to 2015, that list just kept growing. Freddie Gray in Baltimore, Walter Scott, Sandra Bland, and that was as we began our Fatal Force project. And then after about a year and a half, 2 years, I began working on this book that is really about not just talking about policing and about the technical and logistical aspects of it and the debate over Fatal Force, but also really trying to profile the young activists who I met in many of these cities, telling the story of the inception of this, what we began to know as the Black Lives Matter movement.
You wrote in the introduction to They Can't Kill Us All that Michael Brown felt different. It didn't feel like just another name to add to the list. It didn't feel like just another murder at the hands of police. I can tell you uncomfortably, for those listening to this podcast across the world, I am located in Sacramento, California, and I can tell you on behalf of a lot of us out here that Stephon Clark feels different. This has a very uneasy feeling to it because I think ultimately, no matter how strong the protests were, no matter how loud our voices got in the days following Stephon's shooting, we all kind of know how this is going to end. And we just went through a preliminary election in which the district attorney was easily reelected. She had essentially been in hiding since the Stephon Clark shooting. No judgment has ever come down yet on those police officers. And deep down, she's never once filed charges against one of them. And there's a very uncomfortable feeling to the Stephon Clark situation here in Sacramento.
Yes, it's been interesting. I remember one of the things I'll never forget, and I didn't actually make it out to Sacramento till well after Stephon Clark's shooting, but I worked with some colleagues who were on the ground there, and I've since been to Sacramento. But one thing that was really interesting, I think back to this all the time in 2014, every time there would be a new police shooting, what the city would say is, sure, we just killed an unarmed black guy, but we're not Ferguson, right? It was this idea that the things that people were seeing on their television screens could only happen in some crazy backwater place that we've never heard of, and it definitely couldn't happen where I live. This is a problem for those people over there, right? Yeah. We're not Ferguson, right? North Charleston said this after Walter Scott was killed, and Baltimore is burning, and they're saying, no, but we're not Ferguson, though, right? Cleveland is saying this after Tamir Rice. I remember going to a big meeting at a church with the mayor and the police chief, and it was called Cleveland. Are we the next Ferguson? No, we're definitely not, right? And it was this idea that these must be problems for someone else, because in my community this wouldn't happen. And what I think has become clear with each city added to the list is that this is a truly American problem. This isn't a problem about some suburb of St. Louis. This is a problem that's kind of interwoven into the core of who we are as Americans, into how our society operates, right? That our issues of race and policing are not something that is happening over there. They're, in fact, something that's happening right here.
And the frustrating part, Wesley, for a lot of us who, are trying to bring attention to this stuff is people are convinced, people are convinced that this started in Ferguson. That
yes, exactly.
that somehow these issues are new.
And that's the thing. None of these issues are new. None of these things began in 2014. One thing that is new is the preponderance of video evidence, cell phones being everywhere. And that is different. That is a bit new. We can now see these experiences, but generations of people, generations of Black Americans have talked about having these types of experiences with law enforcement. Now, we being the collective society, has chosen not to believe them or not to listen. But these are not experiences that are necessarily new at all. What was new was the media attention and the cell phones. And beyond that also, this was now happening at a time where we had the first Black president, right? And so there was this desire to have the president comment on all of this stuff all the time, which kept these stories in the news.
Yeah, and that's the other argument that you have to have anytime you have these conversations. Like, well, how can there be? There's no big racial discrepancy. There's no, racism is so much further than where it used to be. Look, you had a Black president for 8 years.
Well, of course. Well, because it's almost. as if, and we have to think about this differently sometimes. We have to challenge ourselves to think about this differently. Racism isn't just this like yes/no binary where like either we fix it, either we were racist or we are not. We fixed it, and now it's over, right? That we're talking about, society and structures, 300 years. Where things had been established the way they were, right? Where you have a society that is constructed on this type of inequality. And so even once you fix the rules to largely promote equality, now you still have to make up for the years of building that inequality, right? You still have years, decades, centuries of built-in stereotyping and discrimination and prejudice, and that's going to leave a lingering effect on the society we live in, right? That these experiences aren't made up. They aren't exaggerations. And sure, just because, a black man can drink from the same water fountain as you or go to the same schools as you does not mean that, it's all rainbows and butterflies and we have fixed all the inequality in our society. But I do think, especially as it relates to the police, it can be very difficult sometimes for people who themselves have only ever had positive relationships with the police to imagine what it would be like to not have that, right? And so that, I think, was one of the big cultural disconnects between what many of the demonstrators were saying in the streets, many of the community members were saying in the streets, and what a lot of viewers and listeners and readers were thinking as they saw this coverage.
You're in Washington, D.C. I absolutely feel like the phrase "we fixed racism" is going to be a political, like a campaign slogan one day. Like, we fixed racism. Elect us. Last thing before we let you go, the Black Lives Matter was pretty much, it was born with Trayvon Martin. Mm-hmm. But it really grew in Ferguson, and you were there front row for that. 4 years later, how do you see Black Lives Matter?
Of course, and that is a line I use often. That I say that I think Black Lives Matter, the energy, the ethos of it was conceived with Trayvon Martin and birthed in the streets of Ferguson. Right, that you had between 2012 and 2014 that the maturation and gestation of this energy, and it developed over time and then burst out into the streets in Ferguson. What was fascinating was watching the development of so many of these young activists, organizers, entering politics for the first time. I do think that the election of Donald Trump has really altered the trajectory, in part because it has pushed some of these issues to the back burner. However, that said, many of the issues championed by these Black Lives Matter activists are things that are still things we're talking about. Immigrant rights, criminal justice reform are still things in the conversation. I do think, though, that I think that many of us had kind of perceived this inevitability of a Hillary Clinton presidency, and I think that many of the leaders in Black Lives Matter were not immune to that. Mm-hmm. That a lot of the political calculus was built in with the assumption that there would be a friendly person in the presidency, even if they didn't love who that person might be, someone who they would have to pressure further left, as opposed to someone who would be diametrically opposed to all the things they wanted to do. And so it has been really fascinating to watch a shift in a lot of these organizations, a lot of shift in a lot of these activists. As they've grappled with the Trump presidency and figuring out what it means to deal with a presidency that is truly oppositional to their goals, as opposed to the Obama presidency where, many of the activists didn't love everything he did, but at the end of the day, they sat on the same side of this political spectrum. The same thing would have been true of a Hillary Clinton presidency. And so there's been a lot of development, a lot of movement, and it's going to be interesting. I'm really interested in watching moving forward as things continue to develop.
I think one of the frustrating things with Black Lives Matter, though, is if you're black and you're in the streets and you're an activist, you're immediately Black Lives Matter. No matter what message you're trying to send, you're black, you're an activist, you're Black Lives Matter.
Of course, yeah. You must be doing this, and there's a flattening there, and that at times allows for confusion of messaging and confusion of who really speaks for who. I think also I saw this and I read about this a little bit in the book. I think at times there was a skepticism from a lot of the mainstream media. Who are these people and what are their goals and what are they talking about? And why is this so disorganized? And it's very interesting that was the perception of a lot of this young organization and young activists in places like Ferguson and Baltimore. And yet you watch the Parkland kids, who I think are really impressive, and I've done some work on that case, where the perception of them is that they're hyper organized and they've got everything together and they've got all these clear goals and they're going to change the world. There's not actually that much difference between the way the organizers out of Parkland have behaved and the way that the Ferguson and Baltimore activists behaved. Same type of game plan, same type of organizational structure. But what we see is that if the media is skeptical of you, it can create a narrative around you, and that can undercut your effectiveness.
I can't recommend Murder with Impunity enough. It's a fantastic read. All of your stuff at the Washington Post is great, but They Can't Kill Us All is a must read. And wherever people get books from, whether you listen to books on Audible, whatever it is, check out They Can't Kill Us All. Wesley, you were very, very generous with your time today. Really appreciate it, and hopefully we'll catch up at a Wizards game next season.
Of course, I would love that. I just got these season tickets, so you and then bring whoever else. We're going.
Okay, done deal. I appreciate you, Wesley. Thank you, my man.
Thank you.
All right, be well. For more info on Wesley Lowery, again, pick up the book, They Can't Kill Us All, and check out his work at the Washington Post. Not everyone is going to understand this conversation about the black community and its relationship with police officers. You'll always hear the line, well, just don't break the law and you won't get in trouble. Just do what the officer says and you won't be shot. You'll never see more people come to the defense of a police officer than when a black person, particularly a black man, is the victim. Sadly, many may not see how important the Murder with Impunity study is as it relates to the Fatal Force Project. The data shows homicide in lower income areas populated by black people are less likely to be solved. If black people can see they can't trust police when they're the victim of a crime, how the hell can you trust the police if you're a suspect in a crime? I appreciate you so much for tuning in. If you want the sports side of what I do, be sure to check out The Lowdown every Monday through Friday on Sports 1140 AM here in Northern California. You can listen on the KHDK app. If you're listening on iTunes, if you're listening on Stitcher, tune in, Google Play, whatever it is, you can search The Lowdown and catch the sports podcast there on this very same platform that you're listening to. Be conscious. If you wouldn't mind, if you enjoyed the conversation today with Wesley Lowery, go back, check out our conversation with Howard Bryant. Hit the subscribe button so you'll never miss an episode. Hit the 5-star review if you'd be so kind. If you really like it, refer it to friends, share it on social media, and if you have any feedback, good and bad, dbarling at saclocalmedia.com and at Damien Barling on Twitter. I love America more than any other country in the world, and exactly for this reason, I insist on the right to criticize her perpetually. That's James Baldwin. I'm Damien Barling. We'll see you next Thursday.